Two countries, two deserts, one of sand, one of ice, both sitting on reservoirs of oil and gas so large that the word wealth barely describes them. Norway found oil in 1969. Qatar had been producing oil since 1940, nearly 3 decades earlier. By every early indicator, Qatar should have been the richer nation. It had the head start. It had, for a period, larger reserves per capita than almost any country on Earth. Today, Norway's sovereign wealth fund holds $1.6 trillion, roughly $300,000 for every single Norwegian citizen, invested in global markets, growing every year, untouchable by politicians. Qatar has a sovereign wealth fund too. The Qatar Investment Authority manages somewhere between $450 and $500 billion, a significant sum. But Qatar also spent, by conservative estimates, over $300 billion hosting the 2022 FIFA World Cup, a single sporting event, 8 stadiums, some of which have already been partially dismantled. Norway asked, how do we make this money last forever? Qatar asked, how do we make the world look at us? Both are legitimate questions. Only one of them has a good answer. This is the story of what happens when a nation confuses visibility with security, and what it reveals about every government that has ever found sudden, unearned wealth. Chapter 1. The Pearl Divers. To understand Qatar's relationship with wealth, you have to understand what Qatar was before wealth arrived. In the early 20th century, Qatar was among the most inhospitable places on Earth to sustain a settled population. The peninsula is almost entirely limestone desert. Summer temperatures reach 50 degrees Celsius. There is no river, no lake, no aquifer of consequence. Rainfall is among the lowest of any inhabited territory on the planet. The people of Qatar survived on 2 industries, pearl diving and fishing. Pearl diving was brutal, seasonal, and physically destroying. Divers descended to depths of 20 meters with nothing but a nose clip and a net, holding their breath for up to 2 minutes, sometimes 60 times a day. The mortality rate was significant. The income was subsistence level. Then, in the 1920s and 1930s, Japanese cultured pearls entered the global market. Overnight, the Gulf pearl industry, which had sustained coastal populations for centuries, collapsed. Qatar's primary income source vanished in less than a decade. In 1939, oil was discovered in Qatar's Dukhan field. The discovery was significant but not yet transformative. The Second World War interrupted commercial extraction, and serious production did not begin until the late 1940s. Qatar was still, at that point, a British protectorate, a territory whose foreign policy and external security were managed from London. It would not gain full independence until 1971. The timing matters enormously. Norway gained independence in 1905, 6.5 decades before it found oil. By the time the Ekofisk field was struck in 1969, Norway had a functioning parliamentary democracy, an independent judiciary, a professional civil service, a free press, and decades of institutional development. It had the architecture of a state. Qatar built institutions and then found oil. Qatar found oil and then tried to build institutions. The order of those 2 sentences explains almost everything. Chapter 2. Norway's 10 Commandments versus Qatar's blank page. In 1971, the same year Qatar gained independence, the Norwegian parliament sat down and wrote what became known as the 10 Oil Commandments. They are worth understanding in detail because they represent something vanishingly rare in the history of resource governance, a government that chose to constrain itself before it had a reason to. The commandments established that Norwegian oil belonged to all Norwegians, present and future, that the state would take a controlling interest in every extraction license, that domestic industrial development would be prioritized where possible.
That extraction would be managed at a pace the economy could absorb, not as fast as the industry wanted. And critically, that the revenues would be accumulated in a fund that no politician could spend directly. The fund, formally established in 1990 as the Government Pension Fund Global, operates under a rule that sounds simple and is almost impossibly difficult to maintain politically. The government may spend only the expected real return on the fund's investments, estimated at around 3% per year. The principle is inviolable. Future Norwegians own it. Qatar's approach was not the absence of policy. It was a different policy, one built on a different theory of national interest. Qatar's rulers believed that the country's long-term security lay not in accumulation, but in visibility, in relevance, in making Qatar a name that the world could not ignore. The logic had a coherence to it. Qatar is a small peninsula of 300,000 citizens surrounded by significantly larger, sometimes hostile neighbors. Saudi Arabia blockaded it entirely between 2017 and 2021. Iran sits across a narrow stretch of water. The calculation of Qatar's ruling Al Thani family was that obscurity was the real existential risk, and that hosting international institutions, sports events, airlines, and media organizations was a form of national defense. Al Jazeera, founded in 1996, was not just a media venture. It was a geopolitical instrument, a way of ensuring that Qatar's interests and perspective were present in every global conversation. The 2022 World Cup, the extraordinary investment in Paris Saint-Germain Football Club, the hosting of international peace negotiations, the construction of the world's largest LNG export terminal, all of these are pieces of the same strategic logic. Chapter 3. The Liquefied Natural Gas Revolution. Here is where Qatar's story becomes genuinely interesting, and where the simple Norway comparison breaks down in instructive ways. Qatar does not primarily export oil. It exports liquefied natural gas, LNG. The North Dome field, which Qatar shares with Iran, is the single largest natural gas reservoir ever discovered. Its reserves are so immense that Qatar imposed a moratorium on further development for over a decade, simply to study how to extract it responsibly. That moratorium, self-imposed, maintained, eventually lifted in 2017, is the closest Qatar comes to the Norwegian model of disciplined restraint, and it worked. Qatar became the world's largest LNG exporter. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 severed European energy supplies from the east, Qatar's LNG suddenly became a strategic asset of the first order. European governments that had spent years ignoring Qatar were sending ministers to Doha with urgency. Qatar's LNG reserves are so large that if it extracted them at full capacity, it could power the entire European Union for over 25 years. The question is not whether Qatar has leverage. The question is whether leverage is a substitute for institutions. Chapter 4. The World Cup, a case study in visible spending. The 2022 FIFA World Cup was, by almost every financial metric, the most expensive sporting event in human history. The official Qatari government figure was approximately $220 billion. Independent analysts, accounting for infrastructure spending that was directly tied to the tournament, roads, hotels, the Lusail city development, stadium construction, placed the total closer to $300 billion. For context, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built over 30 years of disciplined saving, currently holds $1.6 trillion. Qatar spent approximately 19% of that on a tournament lasting 28 days. The stadiums themselves are engineering masterpieces. The Lusail iconic stadium, which hosted the final, seats 89,000 people and is arguably the most architecturally ambitious sports venue built in the 21st century. The Ras Abu Aboud Stadium was constructed entirely from shipping containers and designed to be dismantled and relocated after the tournament. It has been. The question that development economists ask, and that the Qatari government has a sophisticated answer to, is not whether the stadiums were impressive. It is whether they were investments. Did the $300 billion generate a return? The Qatari argument runs as follows. The World Cup was not a sporting event. It was a reputational investment, the single most cost-effective way to introduce Qatar to 3 billion television viewers, to establish Doha as an international hub, and to accelerate foreign direct investment in a country that most of the world could not previously locate on a map. The returns, they argue, will compound for decades. There is evidence for this view. Qatar's tourism numbers increased significantly post-tournament. Doha's Hamad International Airport has grown into a genuine hub, routing passengers between Asia, Africa, and the West in ways that give Qatar Airways, and by extension the Qatari state, influence over global travel patterns. The soft power argument is not trivially dismissed. But there is a counter-argument that is more uncomfortable. Norway's sovereign wealth fund does not need Qatar to not have spent the money on the World Cup. It simply needed Norway to save rather than spend. The discipline was not complex. The institutions made it structurally impossible to do otherwise. Qatar's equivalent institutions, the Qatar Investment Authority, the Supreme Council, exist, but they do not operate under the same constitutional firewall. The spending decisions were political, and political spending decisions, even intelligent ones, are reversible. Chapter 5. The Labor Question. No serious account of Qatar's economic model can avoid the labor conditions under which it was built. Approximately 88% of Qatar's population are migrant workers, predominantly from South Asia and Southeast Asia. They operate under the kafala system, a sponsorship arrangement that ties a worker's legal residency to a specific employer, significantly limiting their ability to change jobs or leave the country without employer permission. Under international pressure and ahead of World Cup scrutiny, Qatar announced reforms to the kafala system in 2020. Implementation has been partial and contested. The International Labor Organization estimated that between 2010 and 2019, over 6,500 migrant workers from 5 South Asian nations died in Qatar. Though the causal relationship between working conditions and specific deaths is disputed by the Qatari government, which points to natural causes and improved safety standards in recent years. This is not a footnote. It is structural. The extraordinary wealth of Qatar's citizen population, and each of Qatar's roughly 300,000 citizens receives significant state benefits, is built on a labor system that imports human capital at depressed costs and exports the economic surplus upward. Norway's model distributes wealth to citizens through a fund. Qatar's model concentrates wealth among citizens through a labor arbitrage that imports the work and exports the workers when they are no longer needed. Qatar has 300,000 citizens. It has 2.9 million residents. The difference between those two numbers is the economic model.
Chapter 6. The Energy Transition and Qatar's Clock. Qatar's entire economic model, the LNG exports, the sovereign fund, the labor system, the geopolitical visibility strategy, rests on a single assumption, that the world will continue to need natural gas at scale for the foreseeable future. This assumption is neither unreasonable nor guaranteed.
The International Energy Agency's net zero scenario projects that global natural gas demand peaks before 2030 and declines steeply thereafter as renewable energy capacity displaces fossil fuel consumption. Qatar's own projections are more optimistic, and there are serious analysts who believe the IEA's timeline is unrealistically aggressive for developing economies in Asia and Africa that have no near-term alternative to gas-fired power generation. The honest answer is, nobody knows. What is clear is that Qatar, unlike Norway, has not yet built the institutional architecture to protect its citizens from the scenario where they are wrong. Norway's fund is invested in global equities, bonds, and real estate, diversified across 9,000 companies in 70 countries. If oil demand collapses tomorrow, the fund keeps generating returns because it owns stakes in the companies building the alternative. Norway has, in effect, hedged itself out of dependence on the resource that created its wealth. Qatar's investments through the QIA are also globally diversified. Stakes in Volkswagen, Harrods, the Shard in London, Credit Suisse, Heathrow Airport. But the underlying fiscal position of the Qatari state remains deeply tied to hydrocarbon revenues. Government spending, the benefits, the subsidies, the infrastructure, the public sector salaries, is sustained by gas exports. The QIA is a buffer, not a replacement. Chapter 7. The Citizens Who Never Learned to Work. There is a dimension of Qatar's development model that is discussed privately among economists and almost never in public: the effect of extreme resource wealth on a citizen population that has been, for 2 generations, insulated from economic necessity. Qatari citizens pay no income tax. Petrol, water, and electricity are heavily subsidized. University education and healthcare are free. Government employment, which pays significantly above market rates, is available to almost any citizen who wants it. The private sector is staffed overwhelmingly by expatriates. The result is a Qatari citizen population with extremely high income and extremely low participation in the productive economy. Qatar Vision 2030, the government's official development blueprint, explicitly identifies this as the central challenge: how to build a knowledge economy when the citizens who would staff it have, for structural reasons, never needed to develop competitive skills. Norway faced no such challenge. Norwegian citizens work. They pay taxes, high taxes. The oil fund's 3% spending rule means that Norway's public services are not primarily funded by oil revenue. They are funded by a functioning tax base. The oil money is the endowment, not the operating budget. Norwegians, in other words, are stakeholders in a system they also contribute to. Qatari citizens are beneficiaries of a system they mostly observe. A nation where citizens are consumers of wealth rather than producers of it has not built prosperity. It has built dependence. And dependence, when the source disappears, looks indistinguishable from poverty.
Chapter 8. What the Mirror Reveals. The Qatar-Norway comparison is not a simple morality tale. Qatar is not a failed state. It is one of the highest per capita income nations on Earth. Its citizens live long, comfortable, well-fed lives. Doha is a remarkable city, built at extraordinary speed from almost nothing, a genuine hub of global commerce, culture, and diplomacy. Norway is not a perfect state either. Its fund has made investments that its own ethics council later blacklisted. Its immigration debates are as heated as anywhere in Europe. Its economy still depends on oil extraction that it simultaneously funds campaigns against. But the comparison reveals something specific and important: the difference between wealth and institutional wealth. Norway's money will outlast Norway's oil by centuries because it has been placed inside institutions designed to grow it, protect it, and distribute it without political interference. Qatar's money,
substantial, real, significant, remains subject to the decisions of a ruling family whose priorities, however sophisticated, are not constitutionally bound to the interests of future generations. The rule of thumb in development economics is that any country can be rich for 20 years if it finds a large enough resource. The question is, which countries are still rich in 100 years? That question is answered not by geology, it is answered by institutions. Qatar has the resource, it has the ambition, it has, in its LNG strategy, its Vision 2030, its QIA investments, the beginnings of the right thinking. What it has not yet built is the constitutional architecture that removes the money from politics permanently. Norway did build that. One law, passed in 1990, in a parliament that could have done otherwise. That law is now worth $1.6 trillion and growing. That is the difference the mirror shows. Thank you for watching Macro Atlas. If this episode made you think differently about what governments are actually for, subscribe. The next biography is already being written, and the country it covers made every decision Qatar refused to make.